Welcome everybody to session number 2 for GG497 geological visualization. Last week we went through the basics of maps, went through their anatomy and described some of the things that you can record on maps. Today we're going to take our first step in producing and understanding geological maps, and we're going to start by very simply understanding the relationship between the orientation of beds and the outcrop pattern that they make on a map. And we're going to look at the basic example of horizontal and vertical rocks. So when we talk about horizontal beds, this is the sort of geological formation that we like to think about. This is a photograph of interbedded sandstones and mudstones from near Ogmore in South Wales, and this is probably the easiest orientation of geology for us to understand and display on a map. So looking at this wonderful stratigraphy and this layered sequence, we should probably do some definitions. And we'll probably hear some of these words that are sometimes used interchangeably, but it's not quite right to do so. But we can understand sedimentary rocks as being deposited in beds or layers, which are called strata. And each layer of strata is overlain by a subsequent one to form a succession. So if we go back to that photograph, we can see this succession of individual layers of sandstones and muds. Stratigraphy then refers to the study of the order of this sequence of layers. Now, one of the key tenets of geology is something called the law of superposition, which says that sedimentary rocks are originally laid down horizontally. They are laterally extensive, that means that they occur over great areas. And the layers are deposited in a chronological order, with the oldest at the base of the succession and the youngest at the top of the succession. So if we were to look at a schematic log, this is what we might see in a succession. We have these interbedded shales, limestones and sandstones, with the oldest at the base of the succession and the youngest at the top of the succession. Between each layer we have a contact, and that's defined as a difference in rock type that can be observed. But you can imagine that if we were to produce a geological map which showed every single one of these layers, it would be a near impossible task. So instead, what geologists do, when you have rocks of a similar nature, we group them together into larger units that you can actually display adequately on a map, and these larger units are called formations. So formations will be made up of rocks of a similar nature that individually you can possibly hope to display on a map with any meaningful scale. So let's imagine how horizontal beds would look on a geological map. These are some perfectly horizontal beds, and I hope that you can imagine if you were to walk along the contacts between the beds, and I think you can probably convince yourself that you can see contacts here and here, you would remain at the same height above sea level. It's a perfectly flat horizontal surface, so the height that you are above sea level there would be the same as the height you'd be if you were over there. So the question we want to ask then, well, what would be the outcrop pattern? How would the outcrop pattern look in relation to the ground contours? If you have a moment to think about that. Okay, well, let's move on to map view. And basically what we've done with this map is taken the photograph in the previous slide, and now we're looking at bird's eye view. We're looking at it in map view from the top down. So you can imagine that this might be the contacts between two different rock types or two different formations. And the thing that we understood from the last photograph is that wherever we are along that contact, we're going to be at exactly the same height above sea level. The height of the ground on that contact is going to be the same. Therefore, horizontally bedded rocks or horizontal contacts will be parallel to the ground contours. They'll follow them. They won't cut across them. They won't be deflected by them. The horizontally bedded rocks will have contacts on geological maps which are parallel to the ground contours. So, for example, this is one of our example Benison maps that used to describe ideas, and you can see that when you look at the ground contours, you can hopefully recognize that they are parallel or sub-parallel to the geological contacts. So one thing to take away from the first part of this lecture is that horizontally bedded rocks, if you see contacts which are parallel to the ground contours, you know that those rocks must be horizontal, or at least have a very, very, very low angle dip. Okay, so that's all really there is to say about horizontally bedded rocks. But then let's turn to, I guess, something similar but something completely different by looking at the outcrop pattern of vertical rocks. And it's true that some geological formations, for example igneous intrusions like dykes or some faults, they can be vertical. Also, if your originally horizontal rocks have been tectonically deformed, those originally horizontal rocks can then become vertical during tilting. So how will these appear on maps? Okay, well, this photograph shows some horizontally bedded rocks which have been intruded by a vertical dike. The dike has cross-cut that stratigraphy. So if our horizontally bedded rocks will form outcrop patterns which are parallel to the topography, how do you think vertical phenomena like this dike will appear on a map? What will it do in relation to the topographic contours on your geological map? Well, if we were to overlay some ground contours, it looks like this photograph was taken on a beach. So where the photographer is stood, I guess we can call that 0 meters, and then we can put on some arbitrary ground contours onto our photograph. And you can see that the horizontally bedded rocks are more or less parallel to these, but the vertical dike, it cuts straight across them. It doesn't get deflected, it isn't parallel to them. That vertical feature cuts straight through. It goes like a straight line all the way through each of those contours. So let's try and visualize this for vertical rocks in block diagrams then. And a block diagram is simply a schematic representation of geology in 3 dimensions. You can imagine this block diagram is going to give you a map view on the surface, and then on each other side of the cube you're going to get a cross section, so a slice through that geology and look at it from this angle, and then obviously the other 2 angles on the cube that we can't see. So to highlight those, top view is our map view, and then the other faces of the cube are our cross sections, and they show what the subsurface geology would look like depending on orientation. So let's take our dike from the previous photograph and put it on one of these block diagrams. So this pink polygon is representing our dike. You can see that it's vertical in cross section just like it is in the photograph. And when we look at that dike's relationship to ground contours, we can see that it cuts straight through them. And critically, when we look at this block diagram in map view, so looking top down onto this, we can see that that outcrop pattern in map view, it isn't deflected. It carries on perfectly linearly. It doesn't bend. It doesn't interfere or interact with the contours. It just continues straight through, and it's this outcrop pattern which is the giveaway for vertically bedded or vertically oriented geological features. Okay, just to prove that this actually happens on real geological maps, here we have a subsection of the Penrith map with the orange colour being the Penrith sandstone, and that thin pink feature is an igneous dike, a dolerite intrusion. And hopefully you can just about make out the very faint ground contours. I hope the resolution on your video is high enough. But you can see that as the dike crosses those ground contours, it doesn't move, it doesn't wiggle, it doesn't interact, it just cuts straight through them. Okay, so the point is the dike outcrop is not deflected by topography, and that's how you tell a vertically in place or vertically oriented feature. Okay, so now we're going to go through the process of drawing a cross section which contains horizontal and vertically oriented rocks. So last week we saw how to build a hill profile, and this week we're going to see how we can add to that profile some horizontal and vertically oriented rocks. Okay, so this is our example map. It's just one of our simple sort of Benison maps that allow us to prove concepts. We have a sequence of tuff, marl and shale in pink, yellow and blue respectively. And these rocks have been cut by a dolerite dike, the green polygon in this map. So the first question then is, what can you deduce about the dips of the sedimentary rocks from the outcrop patterns? Well, if we look at the sediments, the contacts between them, between our red and our yellow for example, and our yellow and our blue, we can see that those contacts follow or are parallel or semi-parallel for the pedants amongst us to the ground contours. And as we saw in the lecture, this sort of geometric relationship of parallel stratigraphic contacts and parallel ground contours indicates that those sediments must be still horizontally bedded. They haven't been tilted, they haven't been deformed, they're still horizontally bedded as they would have been when they were first deposited according to the law of superposition. If you compare that though to the contacts of the dike, you can see that the dike contacts cut through the ground contours, and further those contacts are not deflected, they don't bend around the landscape at all, they continue in a linear fashion, and it's this sort of outcrop pattern that tells us that that dolerite dike must be vertical. Okay, so once we've taken in a little bit about the map and understood kind of what's going on in geology, then we can actually get it down on paper by drawing ourselves a cross section. So let's say that we wanted to draw a cross section between X and Y. Well, just like we did last week, we'd slap on our piece of paper that spans the length of the cross section, and we'd mark on our our start and our end point. And then the first step is, as it was last week, everywhere along that cross section to mark on wherever we hit a key ground height, a key contour that we can use to build our hill profile. Once we have those marks on our strip of paper, then we can transfer those marks to the correct heights on our cross-section panel. And our cross-section panel is denoted by this white box, and on our left hand side is our vertical scale, and then we're just going to drop our topographic heights that we marked on our strip of paper onto the correct heights on our cross-section panel. Once we've marked those heights onto our cross-section panel, we can then interpret what the hill profile would be by simply joining up those marks, trying to inject some sort of realistic variation in the hill profile. We don't want any jagged peaks or any impossible gullies, just forming a hill profile that makes sense with the data that we've collected. Then what we do after we've got our hill profile, or if you've already been given a hill profile, if you're lucky enough to have one, you can then put your thin section paper, your cross section paper rather, back onto your map, and then mark on the points along that cross section line where you hit geological contact. So for example here, along my cross section line, I've found the contact between the marl, the yellow unit, and the shale, the blue unit. And then I'm in shale until this point where I hit the dolerite dike, and that continues for this distance. Before, if I were to walk along this landscape, I'd be back into shale, marl, and shale. Now some people would just leave a mark, but I would suggest you write down what the rock unit is between these intervening marks, and if you can do it in a different color to the ground contour heights that you've recorded, then it allows you to tell the two apart. But if you're more of a visual learner, then perhaps what you could do is add a little bit of color to your cross-section strip that equates that color to the colors on the map. Okay, then what you want to do is, looking at your map, add in any of the orientation or structural information about the dip of the contacts. And we've already deduced, just by looking at the map, that those sedimentary contacts between the marls and the shales, they're horizontal, so we could write that down with a little HZ next to our contact on our cross-section strip. But we've also discerned that the dolerite dike is vertical, so we can denote that on our cross-section strip with a little VRT, and then that way when we move our cross-section away, we still have all of the information which will allow us to draw the geology onto our cross-section. Okay, we're kind of more or less done with the map now, so we can take our cross-section strip and put it back against our newly created hill profile. This time we want to drop our contact marks onto that hill profile, onto that topographic profile, and where those marks intersect our hill profile, that shows where our geological contacts would crop out on the ground surface. If we were to walk along this hill, where would we find the contacts between our different units? Okay, so that's what we do. We drop down our points on our cross section where we have a stratigraphic contact, and then what we can do, just to make ourselves feel better, I guess, is to shade in the very top uppermost part of the hill profile to show the nature of the surface outcrops. Okay, at the very least, what this shows is that you know what the geology would be on the surface at that point. Even if we can't understand what the geology is doing at depth, at least we'll know what the geology is right at the surface. Okay, the next thing that we then need to do is try and show how this geology continues at depth. So then what we need to do is take that structural information that we have on our cross section and start plotting our contacts at depth appropriately. Now, to save yourself having to rub a whole lot of stuff out, take a few minutes to think about what contacts are the youngest, or what features are the youngest, because they're the ones that you're going to want to plot first. If you think about it, all of the old stuff has been cross-cut by all of the young stuff. So if you draw all of the old stuff first, you're going to have to rub it out to take into account the young stuff as cross-cut it. So if you start with the younger stuff first, you save yourself all of that wasted effort. So from our map, we remember that the dolerite dike cross-cut the stratigraphy. It was younger than everything else. It's the youngest thing on our map. So we're going to start by plotting that dolerite dike first, and we knew from our map, from its relationship, from its outcrop relationships with the ground contours, that that is a vertical feature. So we're just going to draw those vertical contacts for our dolerite dike right through our cross section. Then the events prior to the emplacement of the dike were the sedimentary rocks, and we know from the outcrop pattern of those sedimentary rocks that they're horizontally bedded. So on our cross section line we've got the contact between the marl and the shale, and we know that that contact is horizontal, so we can just draw that as a horizontal line. Now it depends what sort of person you are, but if you want to feel like you're making progress at this point, you could start adding colour for everything that we're certain of. And I'm certain that the dike exists at depth because it cross-cuts the entire stratigraphy, and I'm certain that these rocks are horizontally bedded. At this point though, I need to take a step back and think about whether or not there's anything on my cross section that would be at depth which I can't see at surface. Okay, I know that the marl exists to this depth because I've seen it on my map along my cross section, but I don't know if there's anything beneath the marl at this point. Okay, I'm going to have to go back to the map and see if there's any information that can tell me what's at the lower reaches of our cross section. So let's do that. Let's take a look back at our map. Well, looking at our map, we can see on the high ground at 500 and 400 meters above sea level there's shale, and then at around 300 meters above sea level there's this horizontal bed of marl. But then I can see at about 250 meters there's a contact between the overlying marl and the underlying tuff. Now I can see that that contact is, if this is 200 and this is the 300 contour, then this, yes, must be about 250. And I can see that that tuff contact continuously crops out across our entire map area at 250 meters above sea level. So what I can do is, even though it doesn't occur on our cross-section line, I can extrapolate the position of this bed onto our cross-section. Okay, so what I can do is at 250, or thereabouts, slightly off on the scale, I can plot the missing elements, or the elements of the stratigraphy that I can't see immediately on our cross-section line. Now there's potentially something else beneath the tuff that I can't see on our map, so I'm going to leave this bottom bit as just saying that the depth of this tuff is unknown, or, you know, some maps say unconstrained stratigraphy beneath this point. Just, you know, you want to show whoever's looking at your cross-section the limit of your certainty. Okay? So now we've got a representation of our stratigraphy, and then what we need to do are basically the good housekeeping parts of our cross-section design. These would include a scale or a scale bar. I personally prefer a scale bar because if you photocopy or shrink or scan your cross-section, you've only got a numerical scale, then it becomes meaningless after you've stretched or shrunk your image, whereas a scale bar will retain its fidelity. You also need to have a key in stratigraphic order, so our tuff, our marl, our shale in our key are in the same order as they are in stratigraphy. And then I've separated out our igneous intrusion from our stratigraphy to show that it's a different sort of feature. It's not a bed within those beds, it's something that's cut across them. And then you've basically done your cross section. Now what you can do is, once you've got an accurate cross section, you can use your cross-section to build a stratigraphic column or a diagram to show the thicknesses and stratigraphic relationships in the area. Okay, and a stratigraphic column, if we were to look at a real geological map, it would have several key features to it. The first key feature is that it has a scale which can be used to convert the column or the representation of rocks on the column to real thicknesses in the area. So for example, the reason that these rectangles on this particular stratigraphic column are different sizes is because these units are different thicknesses in the map area. So B4, if you could measure this on the geological map, this thickness, and use the scale factor, you could get an estimate of how thick that unit is in real life in the map area. If those polygons are a constant thickness on the stratigraphic column, what that's telling you is that within the map area, that unit is more or less a constant thickness across the area. But if on the stratigraphic column, the width of that polygon, that rectangle, changes, if it becomes tapered, then what that's telling you is that that particular unit, it has a variable thickness across the area. In some areas you can't find it at all, and then some areas you've got an appreciable thickness. Then at the base of the stratigraphic column, if it isn't capped with a black line, then what that's telling you is that the maximum thickness hasn't been constrained. We know that the minimum thickness is about this distance, but it could go on for an unknown amount of stratigraphic thickness. So that tells you, that's how a stratigraphic column tells you about the thickness of rocks. But a stratigraphic column can also tell you about stratigraphic relationships, like the contacts between rocks. If you see a wiggly or curved line in a stratigraphic column, that's telling you that that's an erosional contact. There's an unconformity. And in this example, this erosional contact is the current modern day weathering surface. It's where the rocks are being weathered and eroded today. If instead the contact between two rocks is just a simple solid line, straight line, then that's telling you that the contact between them is conformable. There's no real gap in geological time between the deposition of the lower unit and the upper unit. And so what we can do for our cross-section is produce a schematic stratigraphic log just like this real one, but for our example map. So first thing is to get the thicknesses of our units, and to do that we can simply measure the true thicknesses of our units from our cross-section. So the amount of rock that we're seeing in between contacts, that gives us our true thickness. So our true thickness of our shale is about, what's that, if that's 50 meters, is it almost 100 meters? Marl is about the same, and then tuff, it goes on for at least I would say 150-200 meters, but our depth is unknown. Now the top of this shale, or the unit that's currently being eroded, the upmost unit that's being eroded is our shale. So what we can do is plot those rock units at the correct relative thicknesses, but showing the stratigraphic relationships between them. We can show that the top of the shale is being currently eroded by the modern weathering surface. We can show that the relationship between the shale, the marl and the tuff is conformable with a straight line, and we can show that the maximum thickness of the tuff is currently unconstrained by leaving it open. So erosional contact at the top, conformable contacts within our rocks, within our rock sequence, and an unconstrained maximum thickness with a scale that allows us to understand what the real thicknesses of our rocks are in the map area. Now, I haven't included the intrusion in our stratigraphic column, and that's for the simple reason that intrusions aren't sediments. They aren't deposited in that rock, so they aren't really stratigraphy. Okay, so comparing our efforts to a real geological map, hopefully you can see that we're well on our way. We've got a map, we've got a cross-section, and we've just built a rudimentary stratigraphic column that's got a key that describes what's going on. So even though it's a fair bit of information to take in, I think you guys will be fine to tackle the second lab now. But before we go, just wanted to show an example of some fantastically horizontally bedded rocks deposited during the Cretaceous in Dorset. And if you can make out the very faint ground contour lines, and then there's this one, I guess this is the 500 feet, I guess this one is. And you can see that parallel to those ground contours are your stratigraphic contacts. Okay, so this sort of relationship that we've looked at with a simple example is real, and that's how you recognize it on a geological map. Okay, thanks for listening. I'd recommend now that you have an attempt at lab number 2, horizontal and vertical strata. I'll see you next time for lecture 3, where we look at dipping rocks and using structural contours. Look after each other and stay safe, guys.